Hello, and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 15.3 jungle tier list, so if you want content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were some pretty substantial changes this patch. We saw nerfs towards the big three junglers of Elite and Competitive. Wukong, Viego, and Skarner all got substantial tags. We also saw buffs to the likes of Eve, Jax, and Kayn, with some direct buffs towards some of the keystones. Halo Blades, Electrocute, and Dark Harvest all got buffed, so they are performing a bit better on the champions, which usually run them. Let's get into it. The D tier is going to consist of relatively similar champions. The likes of Brand still quite heavily underperform within the jungle. He's very unpopular. The buff towards Dark Harvest does help him if he opts into it, but I know some people were running Conqueror before that anyway. The champion's still just something I'm not really going to recommend. If you're looking for like an AP dot mage which can clear the jungle relatively quickly, there are loads of different options there for you. The likes of Karthus and Zyra outperform him quite substantially currently, and I'm just not going to really recommend Brand in his current state. Maokai's actually seen a bit of a surge in play rate within the jungle. I still don't think he's that great. He's a relatively low agency, slow clearing jungle. He's worse than Sejuani in most aspects, and I wouldn't say Sejuani is a great solo queue jungler. Obviously, the higher up you go, the more these tank junglers will perform, where you can oftentimes give your laners a lot of your resources and then enable them to carry through their higher gold scalings, the need for levels, and your ability to just be more of a utility bot can definitely be more beneficial there. Sylas, very feast or famine jungler. If you get an advantage on this champion, he can be quite potent. If you find yourself falling behind, he'll clear slowly, unhealthily, and just never really find his footing within the game. He's very conditional and very reliant on snowballing. Just a pick I'm really not going to recommend like you have a main, let alone pick in like situations. I still think it is pretty underwhelming. And Bessa is a hard jungler to play. I think she is better than some of the other options within the D tier. She kind of falls into not quite the same bracket as like your Rengar and Nidalee's, but it is hard to pilot like these champions. Like Rengar and Nidalee have very, very high skill ceilings. If you can pilot these picks well, they definitely shoot up the tier list. But for like a mid MMR tier list, which is what this is focused on, these are picks I'm just never really going to recommend. Only in Master Plus do these picks start really finding their footing, and then only in Challenger do they really like start going like heavily positive when you are a main or a one trick at Rengar or someone who can pilot Nidalee incredibly well. The other picks here are the likes of Gragas, who is just strictly weak at the moment. Like Gragas is one of the most underperformant junglers in the game. He really suffers from the fact that top lane is like holding him weak in jungle, and jungle has the rune not the same level of like rune flexibility, rune set, which like top lane has, where you can opt into like Grasp and Arcane Comet. Like jungle Gragas just wants the Dark Harvest or the Electrocute, and then to run around the map and just snowball his advantages. He's kind of akin to Sylas in a way in that regard. The C tier options then are Qiyana, who has made a bit more of an appearance within the jungle. I actually think Qiyana's in one of her better spots at the moment, so if you enjoy playing Qiyana and you're very comfortable with the champion, definitely recommend trying it in both mid and jungle. You can even take a top, like I've seen some top lane Qiyana's, so that can definitely be something which functions. Overall, the champion's still very hard to pilot. Like if you're not comfortable with Qiyana, definitely not mandatory, but it is in a better spot at the moment. The amp to monsters on her Q really does help her, and it allows her to clear a bit better, allows her to just be on the map a bit sooner, and I think the Electrocute changes, if you opt into it, are nice for her. You can also opt into obviously like your Conch still, and like that is a relatively standard rune page. Zed, Talia, like some champions which, actually you could go even further, Zed, Talia, Elise, champions which obviously benefited from the domination keystone buffs, not quite enough to really elevate them within the tier list. Same goes for Teemo. I mean, I think in the case of at least Talia and Zed, they're all relatively hard to pilot champions predicated on certain things. Zed's really fast clear speed is like counteracted by the fact that he has no hard CC. He's reliant on snowballing quite aggressively. Talia's case, she's a bit slower clear wise, but if you get advantages, she can scale relatively well into specific team compositions. Elise is very predicated on early game advantages, making sure you're able to just find or just get the gold you need to really be quite like potent within the early to mid game, and then she'll eventually fall off later on into the game. Teemo's just underperforming. He got directly nerfed this patch, probably a nerf which he just didn't really need to receive. He was already struggling a bit more in the jungle. The keystone, like the removal of the eyeball collection, I mean, obviously compensated with the Dark Harvest buff now, still is negative for him. He also got directly nerfed, and the E nerf this patch hurt him even more. So he does find himself like struggling quite a bit within the C tier, probably towards the lower end of the C tier. Sejuani is a low agency jungler. Like, she just doesn't have the same level of damage as a lot of the other options here. If you're looking for someone with a bit more utility, then she is a great option, but not a tank pick which has like the damage of like an Amumu or like a Zac or a Rammus or Skarner even. Like, these champions will just out damage Sejuani in most aspects. And then Rek'Sai, mostly played by One Tricks, a relatively underperforming jungler at the moment. She could probably do with a bit to like once again find her footing. You can opt into like Halo Blades, which really benefits from a buff, but Conqueror is her main keystone. I believe it's still going to be her most performant keystone even with the buff to Halo of Blades. Moving on to the B tier then. Actually, there's one other champion I want to talk about. Eve is very close to the B tier. I think if you play Eve, she is finally playable, quotation marks. This champion obviously got directly buffed again this patch. It was a pretty substantial buff to the E. That combined with Electrocute gaining some base damage, she's in a relatively decent spot. She's still hard to pilot, and as her play rate grows, she will still maintain a relatively mediocre win rate, as like people who first time this champion will just find themselves losing. But I do think in time this champion will probably get bumped up to the B tier as people refine her builds and the tourists kind of hop off the champion if they don't really find the wins which they want on it. In Poppy's case, she drops down to the C tier. I think Poppy jungle is probably her least performant role. Poppy support benefited from Halo Blades being buffed this patch. Poppy top is a situational decent pick into like high mobility matchups or like your Casantes of the world. Poppy jungle is a fine option. Like, it can work into certain like AD matchups like your Lee Sins and your Xin Zhaos in situations, but isn't as reliable as the other roles. She clears relatively slowly and just isn't as performant at the moment, so she does drop down to the C tier. Moving on to the B tier then, we have Shaco, who had both of his builds benefit from the Keystone buffs. AP benefited from Dark Harvest being buffed. AD benefited from Halo Blades being buffed, and he's definitely doing a lot better at the moment. He's still not like meta or like a high performing champion, but he is hard to pilot. He's primarily played by OTPs, and I'd say he sits as a solid B tier option now. Echo, Kha'Zix, and Talon are definitely some more of the less performant B tier options. These champions all to an extent benefited from the Keystone buffs. Whether they, I mean, in Talon and Kha'Zix's case, should have just stuck with Conqueror. Be interesting to see long run, but people are experimenting with builds, and when 15.4 obviously drops, we will see what like people have settled with, what they feel comfortable with. But right now, these champions still maintain their spot as low B tier options. Darius, Yorick, Pantheon are like anomalies in a way. Darius and Yorick primarily, like both these champions always have extremely high win rates for like gold plus MMR, but then like egregiously fall off like the higher up you go, like diamond plus. Like, these are two really, really good mid-elo champions, to the point where you could argue they should be close to S tier options. But as picks, which like I would recommend picks which I feel like have some level of conversion into higher elo play. Like, you can take these picks throughout like your entire ranked journey, and I just don't think these two picks are that kind of thing. They're kind of akin to Teemo. Some Teemo I think has a bit more, well, previously had a bit more high elo like functionality. These two champions do definitely fall off quite a bit the higher up you go. Pantheon's case, he is, I mean, I would say close to A tier at the moment. Like, I'd say there's a pretty big divide between the 4 here and then the 3 below. But Pantheon definitely was seeing some competitive play now. Definitely looks like a really solid jungle option. I think if you're willing to learn him, he's pretty good here. He obviously falls off quite aggressively as the game goes on. He doesn't scale like most junglers, but at his point and click CC, his early game damage can just enable him to really comfortably snowball the map. He clears relatively well as well, and I'd say he's a pretty solid B tier option. Kindred sits as a solid B tier option as well. I think if you pilot this champion well, she is very valuable. Obviously looking for early invades, like snowballing your items are all very key functionalities of this pick, making sure you're getting your marks, just always having tempo on the map. I believe tempo is just the strongest lever that Kindred has, denying enemy jungler of it, and then maintaining your own and just like taking advantages where you can. Not an easy champion to play. Wouldn't recommend it if you're just not comfortable on the pick. Belveth, doing fine at the moment. Kind of a similar champion to Kindred, relying on like invades and maintaining tempo uptime. Once again, a pick which I'd recommend putting a lot of games into before you really take it into ranked. But if you're comfortable on it, definitely can find results on it in its current state. Vi sits towards the high end of the B tier. Great point and click ultimate, decent damage. Her individual agency isn't quite as high as some of the other options on this list, but she does do decent damage, and Halo Blades Vi is pretty solid at the moment, so definitely check it out. You can still run the Conqueror build. Halo Blades though gives you a bit more upfront damage, and I believe, yeah, Vi is definitely a high beta option, close to A tier in her current state. Hecarim, decent beta option as well. The primary Hecarim build hasn't really changed in a long time. He's still, I believe, going Eclipse at the moment. This pick obviously isn't the same Hecarim as before. He is more built around maintaining kind of tempo akin to these two champions, making sure he is always where he wants to be at the right time, clearing his like camps as quick as possible, and then finding the gank opportunities for the flanks where he can output a huge amount of damage. He plays more like a skirmisher with his current like setup and build, not an assassin, not a bruiser. I mean, although if you get like really accelerated, you do have like some level of durability, like the flat resist on W can be quite valuable, but I'd say he sits as more like a mid to high beta option. A lot of the beta options can comfortably compete with like the A and S tier picks. I just think they're less consistent than the picks above. Lee Sin, I'm going to drop down to the B tier. This champion obviously requires a lot of games and mastery to play really well. I think he is still good. Like, you can definitely perform well on this champion, just not quite A tier worthy in his current state. Skarner, I'm also going to drop down to the lower part of the B tier. I think for solo queue, Skarner is getting close to Sejuani territory. He, once again, lost decent power this patch. He lost CC on the E, which is good. Like, they need to take CC out of his kit. That is the best way to nerf him in high elo without, like, nerfing him too egregiously in mid and low MMR. And then he lost some armor scaling, which I don't think is the correct way to nerf him. I think they should have just gone after, like, flat, maybe W slow, and that would have been a better way, but they nerfed him, obviously, and yeah, I'd say he drops towards the low end of the B tier, pretty close to C tier. There's a chance I do drop him all the way down to the C tier. He's just a pick I wouldn't really recommend for mid and low elo. For high elo though, he's still a very strong option, still probably sits as like one of the best junglers you have access to, being a low income tank who has access to a lot of CC, a lot of damage, and really strong gank angles. What other options have we got here? We've got Zyra, who clears incredibly quickly. That is Zyra's biggest strength. Her ability to full clear the jungle and then have a lot of uptime, so she can go and like harass laners, like push lanes out, get space for objectives, poach away camps. That is just Zyra's biggest strength. Obviously, I think this champ actually has a relatively decent skill ceiling to it. I don't think it is as simple as like just full clear sequencing, and that is like the easy part of the champion. I think what you do with your spare time is where the real skill comes in, and how you like use secure vision, do objectives, can all just equate to a relatively decently hard champion. Not the hardest by any means in the jungle, but like there is skill to playing Zyra well. Ivan, also an incredibly quick clearer. He's very unique in the way he functions. If you're comfortable playing this champion, be like giving up some of your agency to have access to a lot of shielding and just being a more supportive champion, then Ivan's a great option for you. Piloting Daisy and just being on the map as quick as possible are probably the hardest things about Ivan, but once you've mastered them, yeah, I'd say he's a relatively good jungle pickup. Not saying you want to play every game, but if you know you can play around like a single target on your team, I think he's a very solid option. Graves sits within my B tier. He is decent. Like, if you can pilot Graves well, he is a very solid option. You can't, I don't think the current Graves can really sit back and power farm and just expect to be useful at a certain point in the game. Like, you kind of have to get your hands dirty, especially like utilizing, like maintaining uptime with grit, making sure you're ganking at the right timers. He is also a champ like Kindred, Hecarim, Belbeth, which relies on good tempo to really like function within the game. If you can't pilot Graves well, he's not mandatory at the moment. There are easier options than him, but he is a pretty solid B tier pick. Rammus, I'm not a huge fan of at the moment. He is pretty conditional. He's fine, like in the spots where he's decent. In the spots where he's like, but like in best in slot spots, you still probably want to be picking him, but he's just not as high agency as some of the other options, and that feels quite bad when you are picking a counter pick. It's the same issue with Malphite and why I'm not too keen on people playing these champions at the moment. I think if they are overtuned, that's where they become really strong. Like we have had instances where both Malphite and Rammus have been overtuned picks, but as they are just fine at the moment, they aren't picks I'm particularly going to recommend. Trundle sits within my B tier. Jojo as a champion is really good if he just didn't have to clear his jungle. Problem is, he gets so held up on having to clear and having such a slow clear that he feels really bad to play at the moment. But his ability to just stat check most champions, combined with like some of, like the matchup pools, like the AD matchups, the tank matchups, and his ability to like do objectives once you have access to some of your itemization, does give him merit. I don't think he's great at the moment. I still think he sits as like a high B tier option. But if you can overcome some of the hurdles of playing this champion, I think he is in a pretty fine spot. Zac sits as a B tier option. I believe the pick still has access to a lot of damage. He has obviously paid for sins for top lane, but not to the extent that he's like non-viable jungle. I just think he is slightly weaker than he has been in previous seasons. His itemization feels kind of awkward as well. I think most champions which have to go like a Barmy's item feel really bad about it. Like Rammus, I believe Rammus goes full male rush at the moment, but like Rammus when he has to build things like Sunfire feels really bad about just like having to pick up the full item, like the current iteration of it. The old iteration where it was like a ramping damage option felt quite nice. It gave you access to a lot of damage in fights and better objective taking, but right now the current item is just pretty bad, if anything. Like I know Protobelt Zac is very popular in Korea, and that is arguably one of the builds I'd recommend trying out, but you can still just play standard Sunfire Zac. There are challenger players who do make it work, so this pick is fine. I'd say he sits as like a solid B tier option. Jax, I'm going to move up to the A tier, and then Karthus is going to be the other champion which I leave within my B tier. Karthus, I still think is incredibly good if you pilot him well. If you pilot Karthus poorly, I'd recommend just looking at other options. But put the time into this champion. His clear is incredibly rewarding. His damage output is some of the best in the game. And yeah, he's just an incredibly rewarding champion. Obviously, Dark Harvest being buffed this patch did really help him. If he can get access to Axiom Arcanist, he really enjoys that as well. But obviously, Jungle Karthus tends to want things like Last Stand, as it is a very powerful rune on him. Moving on to the A tier then, I'm going to bump Jax and Gwen up. I think both these champions are performing a bit better at the moment. Gwen has always, I say Gwen is an easier jungler to play than she is a top laner. Gwen jungle relies more on just clearing well and making sure you're getting as much gold as possible before your team loses the game. Obviously, her ganks are very lackluster, but once you get like access to 2-3 items, her objective taking, her clear speed, her isolated 1v1, even her team fights are all very strong, and that is the point of the game which you want to play around her with. In Jax's case, he got buffed this patch, enough I'm just going to bump him up from a B to the A tier. The mana change doesn't really matter that much on him. The R change is nice, but it's obviously going to be more top lane skewed, where you're getting access to more levels. And then there was one other change which I just can't remember. Oh, the health growth change for 3 health per level, which is fine. Once again, it's not going to do a lot for jungle Jax, but these are buffs, they do help him. He's now a stronger late game champion. He is still going to be pretty matchup dependent. You're going to want to pick him into like auto-based champions or like your Xin Zhao's, for example. And yeah, I'd say he just jumps from a B tier to the A tier. He's a pretty solid jungle option now. Mundo and Mordekaiser are both going to be bumped up to my A tier. Both these champions doing, actually they were already in my A tier. In Mordekaiser's case, I think he is better than Mundo. I think Mordekaiser's clear speed combined with his isolated dueling potential and his agency once you hit like level 9, for example, is pretty good. Obviously, he doesn't have like the mobility that a lot of champions do, and that is his biggest vulnerability. It can also lead him to struggle in later game fights, but if you just pick out a target, isolate them, either like, or just like kill, like if you can kill them and then secure objective, it makes him very valuable. Late game, if you can just take out 2 champions and that is the value you have, and you like fall after that, then I still think he is pretty solid. Obviously, once his itemization, he spikes pretty hard on like specific items, Rylai, Liandry, stuff like that, all really nice on him. In Mundo's case, he has a very fast clear. He obviously Jungle Mundo avoids some of the problems that Lane Mundo has, where he is a weak laner. Like, Mundo just doesn't really want to be in lane for like the first 9 levels for the most part, because he's very vulnerable to being dove. He's weak in isolated 1v1. But once you have access to the heart still, and you're like able to just be around the map, and you're getting procs of it, you're scaling up, then I'd say he sits as a very solid champion. But he needs to get to that point. He is relatively weak before then, but his clear is enough that you can usually clear your jungle and then just avoid confrontation, and that is where Mundo's biggest strengths really lie. Briar and Shyvana are low A tier options. These picks are great for low elo, pretty bad higher up you go. Like, both these champions don't really exist, like Diamond to Master Plus. That's where they kind of fall out of the jungle pool. But if you play them below that, they are very solid options to climb with. Shyvana obviously wants to get level 6, wants to get like her itemization, her stacking going with the Drakes, and that is where a lot of her like strength lies, her ability to control and secure objectives. In Briar's case, her stat checky nature combined with the if you don't understand how to play against Briar, this champion can feel really obnoxious to play against, and she is relatively popular in low elo, but in high elo, this champion basically doesn't exist. People won't pay it because her R is an incredibly like telegraphed ability. You will find yourself struggling to land it consistently, and you're reliant on just stat checking people, and if people understand how to like kite you out, space free, then this champion just loses so much of its value. What else we got dropping down? So both Viego and Wukong I'm also going to leave towards the bottom of the A tier. Viego is actually pretty close to the B tier now. He definitely took a pretty big hit this patch. The free base AD hurts his clear speed, hurts his trading, hurts his ability to snowball the game. Wukong also lost a decent amount of clear speed, 5% attack speed on E, combined with his W losing CD, which he uses off CD oftentimes within the jungle to clear, does hurt him quite a bit. These two champions are definitely considerably weaker. Not picks I would recommend just defaulting on anymore, but you can still play them if you are very comfortable on them. Fiddlesticks, Udyr, Lilia all fill the bracket of solid AP options at the moment. They aren't the best, but if you are very good at like any of these specific champions, you will find the angles to play them and get the results. Udyr and Fiddle are a bit less popular. Lilia's a bit more of a mainstream AP option. But yeah, all these picks, if you can find the angles and you're comfortable on them, they can be very valuable AP champions within your pool. Volibear wraps up the A tier. I believe that is the only other champion which I have here. All the others I'll talk about after. Yeah, okay, so Volibear wraps up my A tier. This champion is still very stat checky, still wants to get like going pretty early on into the game, but his tower dives, his simplicity of ganking gives him more value in low and mid MMR. He can still function in high elo. Like, this champion isn't null once you get there, but people will just play around him, and he does lose out like later on into the game. He is more of just a frontline option at that point, and the builds are pretty like Volibear has loads of different builds. I see people play him like I've seen like rower jungle Volibears, I've seen like Rift Makers, I've seen AD builds, I've seen tank builds. There are different ways to play Volibear, but overall I'd say he sits as more like an A tier option at the moment. Moving on to the S tier then, we have Yi, who definitely benefited from his last set of buffs. Like, Yi is definitely in a lot better of a spot at the moment. Now that people aren't forcing crit every game, and people are like opting into Halo Blades if they need it, or just playing the Lethal Tempo variant, I think Yi is in a very solid spot, a very deserving S tier champion. You want something a bit tankier, you want something with good AP damage and a very powerful ultimate, then Amumu is the way to go. Both these champions are very performant in low and mid elo. They do struggle a bit more the higher up you go, but they can still definitely function there. If you want something a bit more just like AD mainstream, Xin Zhao, Jarvan, great go-to options. They rarely have times where they are just outright bad. Jarvan obviously can always find one target, which tends to be a mobile, to just isolate and pick out. Obviously, he can find himself in situations where he will just be like hard to play, like into like Poppy jungle and then like high mobility champions. That is where Jarvan will struggle a bit more. Xin Zhao obviously great for like a stat checky AD jungler. He's incredibly boring to play obviously, but you pair him with an enchanter and he can oftentimes feel like a raid boss if he gets ahead of the curve. Great champions which I'd always recommend in mid elo if you're just looking to kind of play something very generic and like learn other aspects of the game. Warwick, great stack checky jungler, obviously very early game skewed, performs quite well in actually both low and mid elo at the moment, and even into high, like Warwick can still function there. I think the changes which he received definitely helped him quite a bit in the jungle, and I'd say he sits as a very solid S tier option. Nocturne and Kayn are my other two S tier picks. In Nocturne's case, his ultimate is an incredibly powerful tool, that is oftentimes what you'll find people power farming for, getting that level 6 and then just looking onto sides or mid lane, getting like advantages in the lane which needs it, and then just using your global presence to be really potent through like 6 to 13. That is where I'd say Nocturne really shines as a champion, when you're sat like a stride breaker, or even the Validity Nocturne is viable, and then just snowballing those advantages, making sure you're getting the people ahead who need to be ahead, and then closing out the game. In Kayn's case, he got buffed this patch, the buffs were nice. He's not the highest S tier option. I'd say he sits as more like a mid to low S tier pick, but both Red and Blue Kayn look to be relatively performant. I believe that Voltaic Psycho Sword might just be the best way to play both variants of Kayn in his current state, but there are other build variants, like you can still go your Eclipses. I've seen Yomu's, I've seen just different ways of playing him, and the buffs, yeah, nice for like preform Kayn, gives him a bit more damage on the Q. I believe you can now full max that ability and it doesn't feel as bad, because previously you would just go 3 points Q into W max as you were more consistently just poking and harassing with W, and then you would just go straight into ultimate. And the two other champions I have here, well, Nunu shot up from the A to the S plus tier this patch. He really benefited from the true damage changes. It allows his clear to be so much faster. Just Nunu being out on the map more consistently enables this pick to be so like potent and powerful. Just being able to gank lanes more frequently, getting access to one more W, like time-wise, and then using that to go top, go mid, go bot lane, forcing out flashes, forcing out, like, just forcing damage, makes this champion very strong at the moment. I believe if you play Nunu, you should, if you have Nunu in your arsenal, you should be playing him. If you don't, it's probably the best time to learn him. He might get nerfed in 15.4. Actually, I think he will just get nerfed in 15.4. I'd be surprised if they leave him in his current state. And then Diana, who I also think will get nerfed in 15.4, performing really well at the moment on the Liandry Riftmaker Unending build. The champion obviously has access to a lot of base damage, and being able to just remain in the fight for as long as possible, having access to like drag people in, and then just like a splash damage with like your Q and W, combined with her really fast clear speed once you get access to a decent chunk of AP. She is the premier jungler I would recommend playing at the moment. Definitely recommend, just recommend playing this champion. Like, if you're looking for an AP option, Diana is what I would recommend people play. I've said recommend like 5 times in the last 30 seconds. Anyway, you get the idea. Those are my thoughts on the 15.3 jungle tier list. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.